Hey guys, today I wanted to go over part 2 of why Darkmantle is overrated. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a few more things that I didn't fit into the first video, and I'm also going to be addressing some, counterpoints in the comments of that first video. Now to start, I just want to, put my summary at the beginning of the video this time instead of just at the end, and that is that I think Darkmantle is very good, and I think it is worth getting for a lot of players. I just think it's important to understand why it is good and when you should get it. So my opinion on Darkmantle is that if you are best in slot as daggers or very near best in slot, that you should not get the set, that not only would it be a lot of effort for a very small amount of DPS on a spreadsheet, I also think there are other factors that actually reduce its value so that I would not even use it if I got Darkmantle for free, for example, and I was best in slot daggers going into phase 5. I also think it is very, on the contrary, better for sword, right? It is a bigger DPS increase, and it would be worth using as a sword rogue even if you have full best in slot gear. It just depends how much time you want to spend getting this set. It does take a very long time to farm all the pieces and gold to buy some of the mats. So it just, at the end of the day, it comes down to how much you want to spend. And I think the most important thing is to know how much it's going to improve your character. First thing I want to talk about is how the Darkmantle set scales with world buffs, and then after how it scales with AQ gear. So to start, let's just look at how Darkmantle scales with world buffs. So a lot of the comparisons in Sims you've seen in videos and guides and stuff have shown full world buffs. And so again, I'll just re-illustrate. If we go from phase 4 Bis Dagger and we switch over to phase 4 Bis Darkmantle in the Garcia spreadsheet, you're going to see a increase in about 8 DPS for Dagger, and that's 0.6%. And this is on the most recent version, the Garcia spreadsheet. If you're not seeing the same numbers, upgrade the spreadsheet, as Darkmantle got a little nerf, I guess, in the spreadsheet for energy. A little bit of energy is subtracted, assuming you're not going to be able to spend it all in certain situations. So 0.6%, right? Now if we take away the world buffs, so if I go down here and I switch to consumes and raid buffs only, and I go back to phase 4 Bis Daggers, and I zero everything out, you're going to see 867 DPS, and we switch over to the phase 4 Bis Dagger Darkmantle, and you're going to see that the difference is 0.3%, right? So we went from 0.6 to 0.3. So essentially, if you're not fully world buff, the increase is half as good. And once we start, approaching the 3 DPS range, right, when we're simming, we start to realize, well, these are really small numbers. And when we consider other factors, there might be other things causing you to lose that 3 DPS by playing the Darkmantle set. So just keep in mind that if you don't have buffs, Darkmantle just isn't as good, right? Not saying it is outright worse than the phase 4 Bis just because of buffs, but Darkmantle has reduced value if you're not fully world buffed. Now we can do the same thing for sword. So if I switch over to the phase 4 Bis sword gear, and of course we need to change the talents to combat sword as well, and we zero everything out, you're going to see phase 4 Bis swords over to phase 4 Bis sword Darkmantle is a 1.6% increase. And if we go back to the phase 4 Bis swords and we add in the world buffs again, and then go zero everything out, and then go back over to the phase 4 Bis sword Darkmantle, you're going to see that we're now at a 2.1%. So we went from 2.1% to 1.5. So the same thing applies where you are seeing more value with full world buffs. If you don't have as many world buffs, it's not as good for Darkmantle, but sword still is better without world buffs by a much more significant margin on the Sims. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, was how it scales with world buffs. Now, after I say that, you might think, oh wow, if it scales this well with world buffs, it must scale incredibly well with gear from AQ. And that is not exactly how it ends up working out. So what I've got here is 2 different versions of the same spreadsheet, And right now they're both phase 4 BIS gear, and you can see that the DPS lines up perfectly, so we're having the same settings for both. And on the right side, I'm going to switch it to the phase 4 BIS Darkmantle gear. So for the foreseeable future here, Darkmantle is going to be on the right, and phase 4 BIS for Dagger is going to be on the left. Now, the one thing I want to talk about is obviously the scaling for gear. And there's been some, I guess, chatter about Darkmantle scaling better with gear than phase 4 BIS. And this is not necessarily shown in the spreadsheet. So the first thing I do want to show is that Death Sting absolutely does scale better with Darkmantle. And the reason that Darkmantle scales with Death Sting so well is because it can make better use of the glove slot that is opened up by not having to use aged coral leather gloves. So if you take those gloves out and you put in Darkmantle gloves, it lets you swap out your Darkmantle wrists for Bloodfang wrists. And that's a pretty big deal. In this case, you actually are able to get the Bloodfang 3 set back right away too, so it's even bigger deal right at the start. Whereas if you go back over to phase 4 BIS, they really, unless they have gotten the gloves of enforcement, right, you're going to have to use something like Night Slayer, and you're not really going to see that big, you're going to see a bigger increase for the Darkmantle set. So Death Sting does scale better with Darkmantle, particularly early on in AQ when you don't have your gloves of enforcement yet. Once you do have gloves of enforcement, the difference is not that big for the scaling, and you see that it scales a little bit better because you're able to use the Darkmantle, but nothing too crazy. So, but that is true that Death Sting does scale better with Darkmantle, especially early on. But let's look at some other slots, right? Because Death Sting is pretty hard to get, low drop rate, contested item. Let's look at some other things, like what about Blessed Karaji Pukio, right? You're going to be your go-to option until you get your Death Sting. You actually see that if we put them in for both the phase 4 BIS and the phase 4 BIS Darkmantle, it actually looks like you get a little bit more damage from phase 4 BIS with the new weapon. But we can try the cloak as well. And the reason I'm choosing these slots is simply because they don't compete with Darkmantle, and you don't get new necks or rings, so it would kind of be pointless to do anything there. So we can put it in the cloak of Concentrated Hatred, and you're going to see that again, phase 4 BIS actually gains a little bit more DPS than the phase 4 Darkmantle. So that would, I guess, counter the idea that in general you scale with gear better as Darkmantle. But let's get into actual pieces that occupy the Darkmantle slots. This is where things get a little more dramatic, right? So obviously, if we were to add in like the belt, since the Darkmantle set is not using the belt, it would be pretty similar, and the legs would be the same for each, right? The only thing I would mention is it makes it a little more difficult in the future as Darkmantle, as you no longer have option to use the belt. But immediately, there's not really going to be that big of a difference if you upgrade like the belt or the legs. But for example, if you were to get an upgrade to the head, right? Let's say the Death Dealer helm, which I actually believe is like one of the easier pieces to get in AQ, and in all likelihood, probably the most likely piece that you get first, considering it is, once you have the reputation, there's not that much competition for the head, whereas a lot of the other items, there's more competition with other classes, and a lot of the rogue items have low drop rates. So in this case, if we were to add in Death Dealer helm for both, Darkmantle obviously needs to try and restore that Darkmantle somewhere. So we're going to go to the belt. We're going to add in the Darkmantle belt, and you're going to see a huge DPS difference here, right? The phase 4 BIS gear actually gains almost 12 DPS from the head alone. Meanwhile, while trying to struggle to maintain the Darkmantle set, you only end up gaining 2 DPS. And if I save the DPS, you're actually going to see that the total DPS is actually higher now for phase 4 BIS. All it takes is one item, the Death Dealer head, and just like that, phase 4 BIS actually ends up doing more damage than the Darkmantle gear. And if we take away world buffs from both, you're actually going to see that things can get even more dramatic, right? Because the gear itself is going to be more valuable if you don't have world buffs, simply because it outright is just more impactful it's a higher percentage of your damage to get an item upgrade. And so you're going to see that we're now at like 5.5 DPS more damage with Dagger if we don't have world buffs. But we can also show sword. If I switch over to combat swords for both of the sheets, and we show how the head affects combat swords, you'll see that over on the left we'll get the phase 4 bis swords, and just for just to make sure everything is lining up right, I'll do the phase 4 bis sword over here as well, just to make sure the DPS lines up and everything's matching perfectly. And you can see everything matches perfectly. So now we'll swap this over to the phase 4 bis sword Darkmantle, and we're back to that 1.6% increase. But if we go and put the head in now, the death dealer head on the left and the death dealer head on the right, and now in this case, sword is able to swap out the wrists instead of the belt because they don't use gloves. You can see that again, we're starting to blur the lines a little bit, right? So now if you don't have world buffs and you are playing swords, once you have the head, the DPS difference is within like 4.5 DPS. And 4.5 DPS is not a crazy amount, and it's very, very easily could follow that you would want to, like personally, I would play the non-Darkmantle set just for the consistency if the only difference was 4.5 DPS. So without world buffs, we're already at 4.5 DPS. If we add the world buffs back in for sword, you can see the difference. If we save it out, you can see our DPS difference. It went from like 26 without the head to now we're down to like a 13 DPS increase. So as it is, in my opinion, I think during 8Q, with how I play the game and how I raid, I'm not expecting to have world buffs, especially early in 8Q while we're progressing and clearing the bosses. If you're expecting to have world buffs at all times in 8Q, Darkmantle is going to be really good. But I would just keep in mind the combination of gear scaling better, except for Death Sting with phase 4 bis. Basically every piece of gear you get will put you closer and closer to getting rid of Darkmantle. Combined with not having world buffs is going to make Darkmantle worse. I think these are factors to keep in mind that you really should, if you already are close to bis or have bis and you're not expecting to have world buffs and you are expecting to get ahead quickly, depending on how your guild does the loot for the head, that might be an argument as to even a sword why you might not want to opt for the Darkmantle set. But that's just some things to keep in mind. Next thing I wanted to talk about is fight length. And the shorter the fight, the better the phase 4 bis gear is. And this is something that I talked about in a previous video, but I didn't show sims. So in the previous Darkmantle video, I mentioned that your increased energy doesn't scale with Adrenaline Rush at all, and that you have a higher chance to like waste energy during Adrenaline Rush, specifically as Dagger. And just in general, if you're adding energy from the Darkmantle set, it doesn't scale with Adrenaline Rush at all, right? More energy doesn't multiply with more energy to do anything. Whereas if you have your phase 4 gear and you have more crit, you have more attack power, that is going to scale with the increased energy. Every point of energy that you spend with Adrenaline Rush is going to be influenced by that extra attack power and crit. So you can see that the sim will represent that. If we go all the way down to the fight length and we change this to 15 seconds, 15 is a little extreme, 20 seconds, we'll say a little bit of time before and after your Adrenaline Rush, and we save out the DPS, you're going to see that you're doing 18, 83, 87. And if we switch over to the phase 4 bis sword with Darkmantle, you're going to see that while we gain 14.6 DPS, you'll remember that it was 26 DPS on a longer fight. So the sim still shows on average that you're going to do more damage with Darkmantle. It does show that the Darkmantle proc has reduced value for the reasons I said, like the energy doesn't scale with your stats. So another thing that's important to mention is It's even going to be more higher variance than usual in these short fights to try and get those procs. So I think it is important to mention that the DPS difference does go down. We can also show Dagger as well. If we switch over to Phase 4 Bis Dagger, and we switch the talents over to Dagger as well, you can see that obviously since the difference was smaller to begin with, in a short fight, if we switch over to Phase 4 Bis Darkmantle, you actually are only gaining 0.1%. So even if you are going to have full world buffs at all times, even if you're going to be, fully buffed up and ready to go, I think it's important to remember that in those cases where you are going to have your full world buffs and Darkmantle is going to be at its best, that you're probably going to be killing bosses relatively quickly, in which case its value does go down. And so again, personally, I would choose the Phase 4 Bis gear over Darkmantle if it were just this alone in a short fight, because I want that consistency. But obviously Darkmantle, you have the high risk, high reward style as well. Last thing I wanted to address was an idea that you're going to get increased prio on non-tier pieces if you have Darkmantle. Now, this is something that makes sense at first, but when you kind of think about it a little more, if you take Darkmantle out of the equation, it really would never be a fair trade-off, for example, for someone to get Death Sting and then, person B gets tier gear, or person A gets the Kiraji Ripper and person B gets tier gear, or person A gets on and on. Basically every piece of item that isn't tier gear, I would gladly take and wait on the tier gear. Belt of Corrupted Agony, Gloves of Enforcement, right? Even the Cloak of Concentrated Hatred. All of the items I've mentioned have low drop rates. Meanwhile, the tier gear is guaranteed. So I think the vast majority of players, I think every player that is educated on how the gearing works in AQ would take the off pieces before the set pieces if they had the choice, simply because they're going to get the set pieces no matter what. They're guaranteed. It's just a matter of time before they get them. Whereas there may only be one Desting that drops before Naxxramas. There may only be a certain number of Pugios you're going to be able to get on Horde side, right? If you're competing with Warriors. There may only be 2 Belt of Corrupted Agonies, right? They're going to get the tier no matter what. And I do not think it is fair to prioritize basically trade tier for gear that's much more rare and much more valuable due to the rarity. So if there's an added incentive, I guess, as a show of appreciation for putting in the effort to get the Darkmantle, that you would get basically priority on an item, that's one thing. But I think you need to understand that it's not fair to the people that are getting the tier gear first while everyone else is getting the rare items. And so if no one wants the tier gear, right, you're not really going to get increased prio because you have Darkmantle on non-tier pieces if no one else wants them anyway, right? So I especially would like to say that, the difference is really small for Dagger, even in the spreadsheet. And I personally think you're actually going to do more damage in Phase 4 Bis. I do not think it would be fair to penalize a Dagger rogue that did not go for Darkmantle and give them tier and take away from them, items that are much more rare. And even as a sword rogue, right? The DPS is not astronomical if you're losing world buffs and as you're upgrading pieces. So I would just think that, if it is something your guild does, then obviously it would add incentive to get Darkmantle. But in general, I don't really think, and this is coming from someone who is going to get the set, I do not think it is fair that you would lose priority because you didn't get Darkmantle, or that you'd be stuck with tier if you don't have it. Meanwhile, everyone else is getting these high-profile rare upgrades. And so keep that in mind, and that might be the situation for your guild, and that might change your decision. But in general, I don't think it would be a good argument that you're going to get increased prio on off pieces if you get the Darkmantle set. One last thing I want to mention really quick is something I've talked about specifically for Horde daggers, so I'll make this quick because it only matters if you play Horde and you play Dagger. But as a Horde Dagger rogue, you use a swing timer, and to try and get an approximation of how much damage that might be, I've got phase 4 Bis Daggers, and I'm going to go over to the part of the fight, or part of the options where it says player delay on instance, and I'm going to set it to 1000. And you can see this note here says if the value is higher than 50% of the weapon speed of the main hand, it will assume you're not timing abilities. So what this means is it's going to use your backstab as early as possible instead of using a swing timer. And you can see it was a 0.8% DPS loss to not use a swing timer as a Horde rogue with Wind Fury. So 0.8% is not crazy, or nothing too out of the world, but you will note that it is a bigger difference than the DPS gain you get from Darkmantle. And so I think it's important to note that if you are playing Horde, you are going to want to, keep in mind that you're going to lose some damage for not using a swing timer. And for example, if we go to the phase 4 Bis Darkmantle gear, you're going to, and we save out the DPS, it says 12, 38, 31. So if you don't use a swing timer with Darkmantle, it'll actually do less damage than if you used a swing timer for your phase 4 Bis. And obviously it does get harder to use a swing timer as a Darkmantle rogue. In fact, I would go as far as to say you cannot use a swing timer on more than 25% of your attacks. And this is because when you're playing Dagger, how energy works, every 20 tick of energy, you're going to go from not being able to press backstab to magically being able to press it, right? So if you're at 59 energy, there's nothing you can do to spend the energy. If you get a tick of energy and you go up to 79 energy, you're not going to be able to wait for a swing timer. And the reason you're not going to be able to wait for a swing timer is obviously if you wait for the main hand swing and you want to gain the DPS from using a swing timer to benefit from Wind Fury, that main hand swing you're waiting on could proc Darkmantle. And in fact, if that main hand swing procs Wind Fury, that could give you an increased chance to proc Darkmantle as well. So you cannot wait for your main hand swing on over 75% of the backstabs, because if you just do the math on how the energy works, when you press backstab, if you're trying to press it, as quickly as you can, you're going to have between 60 energy and 79 energy without Adrenaline Rush. And if you are above 65, you have to backstab without using the swing timer unless you want to risk wasting energy. Now, the higher you go up, the more you could potentially waste. And you could just outright use a swing timer and completely ignore potential energy losses. That's an option as well. But just keep in mind, if you use a swing timer 100% of the time, you're going to waste more energy because the main hand swing timer you're waiting on can proc an energy proc. And if you do not use a swing timer, you're going to just lose more damage than phase 4 Bis. So this is something I want to mention for phase 4 Bis Dagger only on Horde side. So this does not apply to Alliance Dagger rogues. This does not apply to Sword rogue. That's it for this video on Darkmantle. In conclusion, if you are full best in slot as Dagger, I cannot recommend getting Darkmantle. I do not think it would be a good use of your time and money, especially when you would unequip it as soon as you get Death Dealer Head. For anyone who is not full best in slot, it is still going to be good as Dagger. I play Dagger Rogue. I'm going to be getting the set because I'm missing the Bloodfang chest, the wrist, and the belt. And so until I get those pieces, I'm actually going to be not missing out as much on the stats. So Darkmantle is going to be a really good option for me. So if you are missing pieces, or even if you're more under gear than that, and you're just fresh 60 or something, it's going to be amazing gear for you to get. When it comes to Sword, again, great catch-up gear. Definitely get it if you're missing multiple pieces from the Clown set, best in slot. However, if you are fully decked out in the phase 4 Bis, it's going to come down to how many pieces of Shadowcraft you have, whether you want to go through the grind. Personally, if I was full best in slot swords, I would not go through the trouble of getting the whole set if I didn't have any of the Shadowcraft pieces already. It's pretty brutal doing all of the dungeons, especially if you don't have a guild helping you. And I think that the fact that if you get the Death Dealer head and you don't have world buffs, you pull within 4 DPS, and I think it's not that crazy that happens. At that point, I would switch away from this set for the consistency. That's something that doesn't really sit well with me. Pouring in all the time for non-bisc gear is something that you're going to need to benefit a lot from it before you end up swapping it out for it to be worthwhile. But again, if you're going for those big parses, if you want the RNG, go for it. Give yourself a chance to get a lot of procs and get a really high parse. But at the end of the day, I think it's a judgment call on Sword as to whether or not you want to get it. On paper, with full world buffs, it is going to be a solid increase. And so if you are trying to get every edge possible and top DPS, and then it would be something that would be worth getting in that situation. So all in all, Darkmantle is really good catch-up gear. As Dagger, can't recommend it. Sword, I would recommend it. And if you don't want to go through all the trouble and you're already super geared, I can't blame it either. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.